So I'm going to talk to you about nanomachines that read and write DNA and the prospects of how they may be processing information, classically and quantum mechanically, and examine this question of consciousness, especially in the context of living systems. I run a research institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a spin-off company called Nanobiosim. And our institute and incubator focuses on creating science and innovations at the nexus of physics, biomedicine, and nanotechnology, information communication technology. And part of this interface, we look at how do we look at the physics of life, living systems, and consciousness, and use some of these tools and technologies to really address that question. Physics and medicine. And the deeper I went into the study of those, first at Stanford, then Harvard and MIT, the more aware I became just how deep this divide is between these fields in our current modern framework. Most of our physics today is the physics of inanimate matter that hasn't come to terms with life, living systems, and consciousness. Our 20th century physics was developed in the context of systems that operate close to or near equilibrium or at equilibrium, where an interaction with their environment is at best a perturbation. And living systems are fundamentally open systems. They exchange matter, energy, and information constantly with their environment. And most of our medicine is practiced at the level of chemistry and molecular biology, hadn't really come to terms with things like how physical forces, mechanical forces, electromagnetic fields, quantum effects can play a role in physiological systems. So 100 years ago, Albert Einstein gave us a framework to understand matter and energy on some kind of equivalent footing, popularly known as E equals mc squared. I believe that in order for us to use the mathematical machinery of physics to come to terms with life in living systems, we have to expand this framework. And we have to expand this framework to include things like information and consciousness. And we need to be able to understand the interplay of how matter, energy, and information, and even consciousness talk to each other and interact with each other. And we have to make that a hardcore physics problem, not relegated to metaphysics. This is going to take not only work in theoretical physics, but also we need experimental laboratories and tools to begin to examine this question. So that leads me to this. These are tiny nanomachines whose job in life is to Xerox DNA. And I fell in love with these things because for many reasons. One is I feel like they're a good experimental laboratory to understand the interplay of matter, energy, and information at the nanoscale, because these little nanomotors, they crawl along the DNA and they convert single-stranded DNA to double-stranded DNA, a process known as DNA replication. And there are tools that have become available from quantum optics and nanotechnology that make it possible for us to take a single molecule of DNA and begin to ask questions about how information embedded in the environment might talk to or modulate how this nanomachine reads and writes DNA. So I hypothesized some years ago that your DNA is like a piano. And the music that you as an organism make is an interplay of the information encoded in your DNA sequence, the information encoded in the environment. So this interplay of the information embedded in the DNA sequence, the information in the environment, and the information in, let's call it for the moment, consciousness, whether it's your consciousness or a generalized consciousness, we'll revisit that later. That interplay actually modulates what information gets manifested out of that DNA. Let me say it a different way. DNA is an information storage molecule that stores information on many scales. And how you read that information actually affects what information you get out of that information storage device. And these nanomachines are the read-write machines of nature that write information into this code and retrieve information out of this code. So one of the hypotheses is, could evolution, at least at the molecular level, be somewhat more Lamarckian than Darwinian? Instead of being purely random, could influences from this molecular environment be modulating how evolution occurs, how the flow of genetic information occurs? Another aspect of this is, could information in the environment be modulating which genes get turned on, which genes get turned off? Now, we know that from epigenetics, but could it be other kinds of information? Could it be physical forces, like mechanical forces, electromagnetic fields? Could other kinds of information be communicating with how these systems are reading and writing information into DNA? So you can see this kind of fascinated me on many levels, but also it's a laboratory to begin to study this interplay of a system that's fundamentally open, that's exchanging matter, energy, and information with its environment. So I'll come back to the network. So I kind of launched into this on many levels, both from a theoretical side, and my lab at Nanobiosim began harnessing some of these tools to build tools to precision control these nanomachines that read and write DNA. And several of these agencies started funding us more for the commercial and the applications that came out of this than some of the deep science that actually inspired me for this. But these are some of the applications that come out of being able to precision control nanomachines that read and write DNA at the single molecule level, including new ways of sequencing and amplifying DNA with high resolution. But also something I'll talk a little bit about is, can this be a machinery for information processing, information storage, and even quantum information processing? This example of a commercial product that our commercial spin-off company is built, being inspired by some of these precision control capabilities. So here's just some of this is more of a classical control. Here we can take the mechanical stress on a DNA molecule, the tension in piconewtons, and by tuning it, we can control the speed and the direction of how this little nano machine reads and writes DNA. So this is an example of some of the things we can do in our lab. We can stretch out single molecules of DNA and visualize in real time as a nano machine reads a DNA code. And we can measure the position versus time. And notice as we change the mechanical tension, tuning a DNA string, we can slow down the rate at which the nanomachine reads the DNA. Here we're slowing down the replication process. And if we put just the right amount of tension, we can make the DNA motor stop dead in its track and stop replicating DNA. And then if you put even more tension, you can induce the motor to reverse gears and start running backwards and unzipping the DNA. Now, this is an example of how mechanical forces, no chemistry, no biological system, but own, can modulate how the information encoded in DNA is being expressed. And so we've not only done the experimental kind of methods to measure this, this is some measurements we've made on how tension changes the speed at which the motor is running along the DNA. But we've also been building we have published a number of papers on the theoretical framework to describe this experimental data. I won't have time to talk about all that, but here's how, for example, we can record the motor being tuned as it's copying the DNA or as it's editing the DNA. It's proofreading the DNA. So now I'm going to move into the next phase, which is how can we not only precision control these motors, but can we quantum control these motors? And here's a chapter I did in a book, actually, with a foreword by Roger Penrose, looking at, are there quantum mechanical effects in biological systems that are non-trivial? And I examined that in the context of our nanomachines. So can these nanomachines process information quantum mechanically? And if so, could nature have already built some of the first quantum computing systems in the context of living systems? Process information quantum mechanically. And if so, could nature have already built some of the first quantum computing systems in the context of living systems? So why is it important to quantum control these nanomachines? And why is it important if that does happen? Well, if quantum mechanics plays a non-trivial role in the physics of life and living systems and this thing called consciousness, then that would help us build a more complete theory of everything and help perhaps resolve some of those 100-year-old questions about what's missing in the quantum mechanical description of reality. And there are also practical applications in terms of information storage, quantum computing architecture, understanding the role of quantum mechanics and molecular evolution. I won't have time to get into all these, but just giving you kind of a flavor. Now, I didn't talk about some of the theoretical work we did in understanding how this nanomachine moves up and down DNA and how knobs from the environment can couple into and control its translocation. So I modeled this I spent a sabbatical at the Santa Fe Institute thinking about biological networks and modeled this nanomachine as this algorithmic state machine going through a series of internal states, and modeled how knobs in the environment could couple to and modulate this movement along the DNA. As part of getting a language to describe a strong coupling between the environment and these nano systems. So now if you plug that in and you calculate the information processing power of one of these little DNA nanomachines, you find out that, I'll just cut chase, this nanomotor is making 10 to the 11th computational steps for every base pair that it's reading. That's a lot of computation that this little nanomachine is doing to read one base pair. So the question is, why so much decision-making is required in its choosing its movement to those internal states and its translocation along the DNA? Could it be that there's just, because it's reading the DNA sequence, or could it be that there's other information in the environment that's modulating and talking to it that it has to decide between? And so there's a lot of information processing going on at a very high information processing power at the system. So now I'm going to be a little venturesome in the theme of this conference and talk about stretching this a little bit. Just like information embedded in the external environment is inherently, we argue, coupled to how the nanomachine is reading DNA and choosing between some of its states, could it be that consciousness or the mind is also inherently coupled to these systems and helping them choose between their internal quantum states? For example, what we currently call chance or randomness, could that, and I'm venturing to say, that the missing ingredient is consciousness as part of that underlying fabric of reality that's helping to decide between quantum states? What's the intelligence of an organism, an artificial machine, or an information processing device? Here I estimate that by the information extracted by the machine or the organism from its environment on top, and on bottom is the information contained in the environment. So a more intelligent organism gets a higher ratio of the information in its environment it's able to extract. Now the question is, what is this information in the environment? And could it be a hierarchy of information, not just in the environment, but also what we might call a more generalized consciousness? But I will leave you with a thought. At the sabbatical I spent at the Santa Fe Institute, I used to spend a lot of time with Murray Gell-Mann, talking to him over lunch, and he agreed when I said the prevailing scientific paradigm, he agreed with this definition, is that life, mind, and consciousness are emergent phenomena that emerge when matter attains some critical degree of complexity. then it starts to manifest self-awareness and consciousness. I believe that as we advance some of these new capabilities and ways of thinking, that we might find that the laws of physics are consistent with and provide new insights when we look at a new and perhaps ancient scientific paradigm where information, consciousness, and mind are something fundamental to the fabric of reality, even more fundamental than matter, energy, and space-time. And matter, energy, and space-time emerge from that underlying reality.